Well, a very warm welcome, everybody, to the first of a series of free webinars from the Mammal Society. And if you'd like to stay informed about events like these in the future and the work of the Mammal Society, please do sign up to our newsletter if you're not already signed up, and follow our social channels. There's a few links on the screen and they'll be shown later on at the end as well. My name is Matt Larson-Dorr. I'm the CEO of the Mammal Society. We have a number of our colleagues, including Emily from the Mammal Society on today, and our wonderful speakers, Allan and Ian. And we should be joined shortly by Jasmine, who will be chairing the Q&A when we've heard from our speakers. As you may know, if you've signed up and joined this webinar, this is Invasive Species Week. So this is a very timely and useful topic to be discussing. So today we're going to hear from some fantastic speakers, ecologists Allan McDevitt and Ian Bond, with a focus on a species of shrew, the greater white-toothed shrew, which was discovered recently in this country for the first time. Throughout the presentations and throughout the webinar, please do feel free to share your thoughts, reflections and links on the chat. And we'd love to know where you're dialing in from. So just introduce yourselves and feel free to put links to blogs or to projects and to your websites so we can see who's on this community webinar today. If you have any questions, however, that you'd like the speakers to respond to, please post them on the Q&A. So there's a Q&A button on your Zoom controls. So rather than them getting lost in the chat, please do put them in the Q&A and we'll be able to run through them at the end. This webinar is being recorded, so if you prefer for your name not to be mentioned when your question is answered, please change your display name if you can, or just state in the wording of the question that you prefer to be anonymous, and that won't be read out. Okay, fantastic. Without further ado, I will pass over to our, oh no, hang on, before I do that, just a quick introduction to the Mammal Society. So for those of you that are not already members or long-term supporters of the Mammal Society, we are an organisation dedicated to monitoring, study and conservation of mammals across the British Isles. And we've been going since 1954, so approaching our 70th anniversary. You can follow our work on mammal.org.uk or through the social channels that I've already mentioned. And our vision is on screen there, a future in which sustainable mammal populations thrive as part of healthy and diverse ecosystems benefiting people and nature across the British Isles. Our mission is threefold. We work to ensure a bright future for mammals through the work that we do to support and enhance conservation projects and policies. But we also empower conservationists, students, citizen scientists and nature champions to play a key role in mammal conservation. And there's ways that you can get involved in our training, through use of our resources and through taking part in our fantastic survey activations, which Jasmine will mention at the end. We also seek to build public awareness of and support for mammal conservation through education, communications and campaigns. Okay, without further ado, I'm going to pass over to our first speaker, Allan, and then when the presenters have finished their fantastic presentations, Jasmine will lead a Q&A. Thank you very much. Let me just end my sharing. Oh, let me set them down. There we go. So over to you, Allan, if you're able to share your presentation. I think you're sharing your own slides, aren't you?
Yes, so in a sec. Can we see that's okay?
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, okay. Just have to make sure. Okay, thanks for asking me to come along to speak today on this. It's always good to speak on behalf of the Mammal Society's webinar series as well. I was involved with the Mammal Society for a long time too, and it's always great the projects, initiatives and conservation that they do. So unusually, this is kind of two shrew talks in a row, I guess, in the Mammal Society. Shrews are in the spotlight for once. So Dina Deckman spoke a couple of weeks ago now, wasn't it, on their amazing ability to change their morphology and physiology during the winter period in order to survive. Unfortunately, today we're telling a story a bit on the negative side of shrews, in that mainly to talk about the recently invading greater white-toothed shrew. Why it's of interest, of course, in Britain now is that it was recently discovered there, and I'm going to let Ian obviously talk about this fascinating discovery for better or worse a little bit later. But what I will introduce kind of at the start is I'm going to talk about what has happened essentially in Ireland, because this invasive species has been there for a lot longer period of time. Me personally, I've been working on shrews for 20 years now. Geez, when you say it like that. I started my PhD on them in 2003 in Ireland on the pygmy shrew there. So I've kind of been there on this journey throughout all of this happening between our native shrew and this invading shrew. So I'm just going to talk through that and some of the personal journey through this a little bit as well. Did create some big headlines in Ireland at the time. When do you ever see shrews appearing on the front cover of a newspaper on the left? Free newspaper, right enough. The Metro, which is handed out on trains and buses, but was considered a big deal in Ireland at the time. We have all these awful puns around taming of the shrew and blaming of the shrew and all these other things, but certainly caught the public's attention. And I'll speak about why in Ireland it has been over a period of time as well. And if we whiz all the way back, like admittedly for me, even starting my PhD in 2003, is that Ireland was a very simple place for small mammals pre-2007, that if we kind of consider our wild small mammals at the time, we had the wood mouse, we had the pygmy shrew, and importantly, our only shrew at the time. And we also had another wild mammal, the bank vole, which incidentally in Ireland is also another non-native invading species. It's believed it was introduced around the late 1920s from Germany during the building of the hydroelectric dams at the time. So a very, very small makeup in Ireland, relatively simple. And this happens with a lot of the mammal species, almost, that Britain is a subset of Europe's mammals, and then Ireland tends to be a subset of Britain's mammals, and it's to do with the complex dynamics of the colonization history of the species in terms of both natural colonization and a lot of human-mediated colonization as well. And then in 2007, a discovery was made by Dr. Dave Tosh there on the right, someone who I work with still a lot to this day, where he was handed some pellets from barn owls and kestrels and noticed a strange jaw with white teeth only essentially in it. And what they found, Dave, along with his colleagues Ian Montgomery and John Lusby of Birdwatch Ireland and John O'Halloran in UCC down in Cork in the south of Ireland, is that they found in the X's represented here that there was several locations where these jaws were present in the pellets of the birds of prey, and also represented in the circles there. They also undertook live trapping as well and found that they actually found the species by live trapping it as well. So a new species for Ireland, right? And at the time, it was maybe thought, not such a big deal because we have lots of, not many small mammal species present, lots of predators around, birds of prey. Maybe this might be a beneficial thing. And the two species normally coexist with each other on the continent. And essentially what this species is, which we're going to learn about now, the greater white-toothed shrew, is that this is brilliantly put together by the Mammal Society, is that it is a species which is quite similar in size to the common shrew, which a lot of people might be familiar with within Britain, as a kind of grayish to brownish color. The main distinguishing features of it is that it has very prominent ears, which the red-toothed shrews tend not to have, and its snout as well tends to be a lot thicker, which is a little bit more rodent-like. Its tail as well is not as hairy and thick, it has these little kind of thin hairs on it. But probably, as its name suggests, the major distinguishing feature between the two is that its teeth are white, greater white to the shrew, which is in contrast to the Sorex shrews, like the pygmy shrew and the common shrew, which have red tips essentially on their teeth, which we can see there basically on the kind of bottom of the screen towards the right, these kind of red iron deposit tips on their teeth. Some of the other differences, though, in terms of their ecology as well, is that they're normally distributed in Northern Africa and Western Europe. We believe that they colonized approximately about 25,000 years or so, that they originated in North Africa, but then colonized Europe. A major difference in them between them and Sorex shrews is that they're social shrews. Common shrews and pygmy shrews are very territorial animals, in which that breaks down admittedly during the breeding season, but they're social shrews who live together generally in family groups in communal nests, and normally they form monogamous pairs between the males and females as well. Sorex shrews do not do this. They're very densely populated as well, where they're found. Just to give you an example, where you might have in Ireland, 5 pygmy shrews in a 200-meter stretch, for instance, of hedgerow, you will find between 30 and 40 greater white-toothed shrews in that same stretch. So it gives you a sense of just how more densely populated they are. In France, they're often referred to as the house shrew as well, common name sometimes informally because of their tendency to be around dwellings, and they will come into houses as well and build these nests a little bit more frequently than pygmy shrews and common shrews, which, although we will do this from time to time, it's quite rare. Most of us see this when a cat brings them to us. They don't have the extreme high metabolic rates either of the red-toothed shrews, like common and pygmy shrews, where often they are more found in warmer climates, particularly around the southern parts of Europe, where the red-toothed shrews are more cold-adapted species. And Dina Deckman was talking about the incredible adaptations that they undertake. The white-toothed shrews do not do this, as far as we are aware. Also, the thing as well is that their audible squeaks are a lot more, we can hear them a lot more clearly. That if they're there in the hedgerows, you can certainly hear them chattering a lot, which might also feed into the idea that they're more social animals as well. Pygmy shrews and common shrews, we often talk about, it's quite difficult to hear, and often children can hear it a little bit better because of the differences in frequency that children hear compared to adults. And one of the things, smellier, very smelly, a lot more than red-toothed shrews. And on this individual here on the right, this is a caught individual in Ireland, between its foreleg and hind leg there on the right, you'll see this flank, which looks like it's an white area of hair. That's actually a gland, which the males have, which gives off this very pungent urine-like smell during the breeding season, which is obviously attractive to the females of the species, but is very noticeable as well, particularly if you end up getting the species in your house, which is happening more and more frequently, particularly within Ireland as well. So a new species, thought that's fine. But one of the disturbing things then discovered by Ian Montgomery's group in 2010, 2011 is where the greater white-toothed shrew is, which is represented by the hatch line 2010, 2008, a kind of central hexagon there on the screen. The grayer area there is where the invasive bankfoal is present in Ireland. What they found was in 2010-11 is that wherever the greater white-toothed shrew in the top and the bankfoal were present, is that the pygmy shrew within this area had disappeared. This was rather admittedly surprising at the time, so much so that someone who'd worked on these species for a long time, I didn't necessarily believe it at the time. Some of the things I was concerned about, admittedly, was that this was using snap traps, and these are not usually the best things at capturing small mammals, particularly very, very light pygmy shrews. So the question we had is, was this actually true? And also the case as well, because of this trapping method, we thought we would instigate a much more intensive trapping program starting in 2012 to get a full picture of where this invasive species essentially was. So what we did is that myself and my dad, that's me sitting in the foreground, that's 10 years ago, so that's why the hair color is a lot different. This is post having 2 kids. You'll see then that's my father walking towards me in the background as well, who's is a retired biology teacher. So most shrew missions he was on in some form during the summer, even when he was still working as well. And we started using these trip traps, which are these small plastic traps, which are very, very sensitive, particularly for pygmy shrews. We found they work a lot better than Longworth traps from many years of trapping in Ireland and continental Europe. And also as well, we decided along with Birdwatch Ireland and as well as Ian Montgomery's group and Dave Tosh and others to use all these records from the public, from birds of prey and live trapping at approximately 125 sites or so. So very intensive trapping program over a period of 4 months and taking in all this other data as well. What we found is that the range in 2012 represented by the red and 2013 represented by the purple, kind of pinky purple squares, the range was quite significantly greater than was first thought in 2011 by the trapping of Ian Montgomery's group, which is represented in the blue, essentially hexagon there in the center. That yellow triangle in the middle is representative of where they thought they originally were in the original 2008 study as well. So you can see that we're talking about a much larger range, even 1 year later than we originally thought they were. You'll also notice as well is that there's also some jumps, that if you see the 01, the purple squares on the top right, near County Westmeath in Ireland, there was also an established population there as well. Also in the south, 02 in Cork City, there was another outlier population as well, and in 03 over to the west, to the left, in the green diamond, there was also a record from out there in 2010 as well. Right enough, we trapped a lot more out there and didn't find them again, but certainly the other outlier populations. So as well as seemingly rapidly expanding, it also seems that there was these kind of jumps occurring within the country as well. And that's probably what we might expect of a species which seems to be associated, not too perturbed by living close to humans as well. So being essentially moved around within the island as well. What was remarkable is that we estimated the expansion of this, and this was estimated at about 5.5 kilometers a year. This was done by modeling work from modeling from the present day backwards. And we think that the population probably established around the early 2000s is when it was first introduced. Molecular work has suggested that it likely came from France, and we opposed, so kind of have suggested that it probably has come in with a lot of tree nurseries which were going up around the area at the time. So a very rapid expansion rate. Even we had some doubts about this in general, if it was maybe an overestimate, but when we went back several years later and with all the new records, this is essentially held. When we went back 4 or 5 years later, we found the range had moved about 20 to 25 kilometers outwards. So it does seem that it very much is a rapidly invasive species moving out. This is the picture now in 2023. You'll also see there's also some more jumps occurring in the very west over in County Galway as well. So there's other outlier populations existing within the species as well. So all over the place already, right, within a very short period of time. The other question we had though is, was the pygmy shrew really disappearing? And this, what we attempted to do was within the area of where the greater white-toothed shrew was, we undertook transects of sampling from north to south in these essentially cross patterns that you see on the screen. And basically what we found was that within the dark gray area in the center, it was indeed the case that the pygmy shrew had completely vanished within these areas. And it's only within the lighter gray, so areas where the greater white-toothed shrew is just starting to reach, that's where we see that the two species essentially are coexisting with one another, at least for a while. And this is backed up essentially by this graph on the right, where the blue is represented by the greater white-toothed shrew's presence, an abundance of them, sorry, I should say. They're number of individuals. And basically speaking, where we have a lot of greater white-toothed shrews, so a lot of blue, we have no pygmy shrews, and so we don't see pygmy shrews until we have a small number of greater white-toothed shrews, or in other words, areas where the greater white-toothed shrew has just established, right? But basically what we found is these areas we trapped in 2012. When we went back 1 year later, so in 2012, greater white-toothed shrews and pygmy shrews together in areas where the greater white-toothed shrew had just invaded. We went back 1 year later, pygmy shrews gone, right? So it shows just how rapid this replacement event was essentially happening. So a confirmation of the original work by Ian Montgomery's group in Queens, that yes, indeed, that the pygmy shrew is definitely disappearing from areas where the greater white-toothed shrew is present. The question, of course, is though, of why can't they coexist basically with one another? This is the big point. A number of theories that we had, at least at the beginning, was the greater white-toothed shrew is known to be a species which outcompetes other species of shrew. This is an example from Switzerland, where the greater white-toothed shrew and the bicolored, it's commonly referred to as the bicolored shrew on the bottom left there, Crocodura leucodon. What they found in Switzerland, if you look on the top where the circles are, that represents the greater white-toothed shrew. Then where the triangles are represents the bicolored shrew. And what essentially you see happening over time is where the greater white-toothed shrew comes in, is that gradually over a period of decades, it's pushing essentially the bicolored shrew out of its range. So it seems to be a species which outcompetes other shrews. And this has also been demonstrated on several French islands as well, that as soon as it has been introduced, other species of shrew, and in most cases, white-toothed shrews, disappear over a very quick period of time. We also know as well the pygmy shrew, of course, is Ireland's only shrew. This is the pygmy shrew on the left compared to the common shrew on the right. Pygmy shrew is present on Ireland and a lot of the UK islands, such as Orkney and the Outer Hebrides as well. The pygmy shrew, of course, then has been living for a very, very long period of time, essentially without competitors. So it's essentially had this niche of its own within Ireland without a similar species which focuses solely probably on the prey that it essentially does on the island. And this is where we come into thinking about this then, was it something to do with diet? And this is where Dr. Samuel Bryant came in, undertaking his PhD in the University of Salford at the time. And the great thing about this was another father and son team. This is Sam on the bottom right, along with his father, Stephen, who sadly is no longer with us earlier this year. But Sam and his dad went out essentially to sample shrews to try and get an indication of potential resource competition between the two shrews. And what we were trying to do this is we proposed using DNA metabarcoding, which is essentially taken, rather than trying to feed through all the little bits and pieces of insects that you might find within their diet, looking for bits of leg, bits of exoskeleton, etc., and trying to identify what it was. We decided to use a DNA metabarcoding approach, which is essentially taking all of that, mashing it up together, mixing it, and then extracting the DNA essentially from that big insect soup, for want of a better phrase. And DNA metabarcoding is essentially, this is another PhD student in the group, Thomas Kern, who used to use this analogy, which is a pretty good one, is that we can use DNA barcoding if we want to look at one thing. So essentially, if you wanted to know what one bar of chocolate was, but metabarcoding essentially is if you have a multi-pack of chocolate bars and you're essentially trying to find out all the bars which are in that multi-pack. So you're trying to find out all basically the species which are being consumed within the diet using this technique. We get their DNA and then we're able to match that to a reference database to determine usually what genus it is. A lot of the time not able to determine what species, but at least a lot of the time the order and the genus which the species are from. And basically what we did was we went out then and we sampled along transects The green representing areas where it's only the invasive greater white-toothed shrew now present. The orange and green representing areas where both species are present together for a limited period of time. And then the orange on the outside represented where it's only the pygmy shrew. So the greater white-toothed shrew has not reached these areas yet. So in other words, what is the diet when it's just the greater white-toothed shrew? What is the diet when it's the two of them together? And what is the diet when it's just the pygmy shrew? We also use a control site on the, you'll see it on the bottom right, which is an island off France called Belle-Île, where we have pygmy shrew, greater white-toothed shrew, wood mouse, and bankfold present. So it's essentially a little mini Ireland, if you like, in terms of their small mammal composition. Remarkably, the pygmy shrew is very abundant there, along with the greater white-toothed shrew, and we think that has been the situation there for at least 8,000 years or so, based on molecular dating that I did back in my PhD days. So we also wanted to look at what were the two species doing there as well. And although this graph looks terrifying, right, I'm going to essentially try and break it down a little bit just to talk through these results. We have the greater white-toothed shrew on the left, we have the pygmy shrew in the white on the right, and each color represents the proportion of a particular order of invertebrates within their diet. We also as well looked at how big the animals were within the system too. If we just briefly just look at the pygmy shrew first, Belle-Île is the French island, is on the right. Then we have in the middle column represents where the greater white-toothed shrew and the pygmy shrew are together. And then on the left represents where it's just the pygmy shrew, so the greater white hasn't invaded these areas yet. Broadly speaking, the pygmy shrew's diet stays pretty similar enough during in these different areas as well. Lots of, in the pink, generally spiders. The dark green represents essentially beetles. The light green is kind of flies. The gray is some centipedes. The blue represents isopods or wood louse, for instance, as well. The pink, light pink there near the bottom represents Lepidoptera, which is, of course, our butterflies and moths, so caterpillars. Surprisingly enough as well is near the bottom, second up is a kind of darker pink color. That represents snails and slugs, which is something we didn't necessarily think were an important component of the pygmy shrew's diet, but seems to be a relatively large proportion. Now, whether they are maybe feeding off these when they're dead or something to do with the slime, not quite sure. In terms of they're actively predating on them or not, or maybe smaller versions of them, we're not so sure, but it does seem that it's a significant component. So something interesting there, which we weren't aware of pygmy shrews before, but their diet remains relatively consistent throughout the areas. The greater white-toothed shrew then, in terms of its comparison with the pygmy shrew in the island of Belle-Île, this is the French island, is a little bit different. We see the kind of orange color there, which is Julida, which is these kind of millipedes, but significant number of isopods in the blue as well. Also dark green brown color, a little bit of worms, but you know, not massively different, but certainly you can see some distinguishing features between the two species where they live together on Belle-Île. The question is though, what's happening in Ireland? And this is where we see the big change. Generally speaking, in the middle column is where this is what the greater white-toothed shrew does when it first enters an area. So in other words, when it first comes into contact with the pygmy shrew, or it first comes in and newly invades an area. What we see is that these greater white-toothed shrews are eating a lot of beetles in the dark green. They're also eating, in that kind of browny greeny color, a lot of earthworms, right? This is the group that they're from as well. Also, the kind of very light green is pill millipedes as well, right? So, but we're seeing essentially, you know, them feeding on larger invertebrate prey. This is what they're doing, right? Interestingly, if you look at the bottom as well, that's the weight of these individuals. These individuals are much bigger, right? So they're bigger individuals when they first invade an area, feeding on bigger things. What happens though then is that once they become established, and the pygmy shrew is no longer there, so the density of the populations increases and they become established after a few years, we see a shift in the diet, right? We see that earthworms and such don't become so important. We see that beetles don't become so important. And we see that in the light pink, spiders all of a sudden become more important. Wood lice, the isopods in the blue color, become more important as well, right? And other groups of insects start to enter, or invertebrates, I should say, start to enter into their diet as well. So they're changing what they're doing. What we think is happening, and others have proposed this as well, is that because they will eat what is there, is that when they first come into an area, they're eating out all the big invertebrate prey, and then likely reducing that particular resource or exhausting that resource. And it's been proposed that they've done this before in Switzerland too, that they exhaust the local resources of invertebrates. And then they're starting to feed then on other sources of invertebrate prey, generally smaller invertebrates. And what's interesting here is that then you'll notice that once they've essentially exhausted the resources of the bigger invertebrate prey, their prey then, after they become established, is a lot more similar to what the pygmy shrew's diet is essentially composed of. So now you have the greater white-toothed shrew, after it becomes more abundant and established, enters into the niche of the pygmy shrew. And because the pygmy shrew is not used to this competitor, and it's a lot more abundant, that ultimately then we see then the pygmy shrew succumb to this newly invasive species, right? And just to represent this in essentially another way, what we're basically seeing is that the overlap in diet increases from 11 to 14% when they first come into contact, that then when the greater white-toothed shrew becomes more abundant and established, the overlap in their diet then increases to over 40% between the two species essentially then, right? So the green represents where the greater white-toothed shrew first invades. You see this diet is a lot different than the pygmy shrew. Then after, in the kind of yellow orangey color, then you see that there's a lot more overlap between the two shrews in this case. And this is what we're proposing then is probably the reason why one is disappearing. Could be more complicated, of course, than this. We're also investigating though as well. We know that the greater white-toothed shrew has brought in a novel strain of Leptospira. We're also investigating their internal gut parasites as well. And also this is definitely been led by Sam Browett again. Hopefully he's here somewhere in the audience. Also investigating lots of pathogens and parasites and looking at their microbiome and fungal microbiome as well, to essentially look at the dynamics between this and the diet as well as potentially a way to explain it. But of course in Ireland, it's too late. Basically, spreading rapidly. Probably our hope is that on a lot of the offshore islands where the pygmy shrew is present, particularly on the north, west and south on its own still, might represent a sanctuary. But is this kind of, certainly their spread is going to continue on in the way that it has been. Is the impacts in the pygmy shrew? Probably. There might be some refuges though in more kind of peatland areas out over to the west of Ireland, particularly in Donegal, Connemara and in Munster in the southwest. But it's not looking like a good story for what's happening, the Irish pygmy shrew at least. And that of course then brings us on then to what about Britain? So we know now that it's here, and it also was discovered in Norway a few years ago as well. We only found out that recently. Because Britain is a more larger shrew community, pygmy shrew, common shrew in the center, and of course the absolutely stunningly beautiful and elusive water shrew on the bottom right, what is going to be the impacts then of potential impacts of this species on these particular? And this is something maybe that we can come back to, because I think it's important now that Ian shares the story then without me giving too many spoilers about what's happening in Britain in terms of the discovery. So I'll hand it over in.
Thanks so much, Allan. So we'll pass over to Ian, who has that story about the discovery of the greater white-toothed shrew for the first time in this country. So if I just, that's it. Go ahead.
Am I leading now?
Yes, please.
Right. Good afternoon, everybody, and please meet Jeff. for about a week last year, Jeff was probably the most famous cat in the country. When the Mammal Society put out a press release about the discovery of the shrew, I got loads of media ringing me up. About 2 of them wanted to speak to me, the rest just wanted pictures of the cat, basically. And as you can see, he's sat there waiting for his latest meal of small mammals. Interesting, one of the media that did want to speak to me was a Guernsey Post. And this is actually big news in Guernsey, because until Jeff spoilt it, they were the only place in the British Isles which actually had the great white-toothed shrew. And apparently people go to Guernsey just to see the shrew. So Jeff made a little bit of a hit on the Guernsey tourist industry there. And of course, this is what the fuss was about. This is a post by Melissa Young, who happened to be my Facebook friend, sort of fortunately just shortly before this. And she posted this very cute little picture. I do think it looks like a wombat. That's how I always describe it. But Jeff found this little chap in the garage last night and safely released it back outside. That side actually was technically the garage, and it did peg it shortly after that, unfortunately, or fortunately, it's depending on your point of view. Anyway, I sort of saw this. I thought, well, that looks like a great white-toothed shrew. Obviously, I couldn't be 100% sure. I've never actually seen one before. So I asked her to put it in the freezer for me, and which she did. And I'm kind of kicking myself now for not rushing straight up there, but it was almost a year before we actually caught up, and she handed me the shrew, which had wispy hairs on its tail and, of course, white teeth. So definitely a white-toothed shrew of some description. But more than that, Melissa then started looking back over her Facebook posts, and this one from back in 2015. 2 presents from Loki this morning. Hi on catnip, you managed to catch a shrew in the garage. Not bad for a disabled cat. And again, this is pretty clearly a greater white-toothed shrew. That's 2015. Unfortunately, I wasn't her Facebook friend back then, so I missed all of these. But essentially, she'd almost posted a picture of a shrew each of the intervening years. And her cat had also caught one in 2014, which she didn't have a picture of. So potentially it had been there for almost 9 years, them getting into her garage. So that was kind of how the story came about. This is kind of where we're up to now, which isn't a lot further forward, actually. So if you look on the screen on the top right, the X, the black X, the lower right is Melissa's house. In 2022, where the other black X just to the upper left of that is, Tim Palmer and some of his colleagues from Wardle Armstrong were doing an ecological survey at Hortley Spring, and they were standing outside a wall to see if any bats came out of it, and they could hear shrews squeaking in the bottom of the wall. But they also got some droppings out of there, which were rather strange droppings, not like bat droppings, but they weren't sure what they were. So they got those analysed, and Allan confirmed that they were actually greater white-toothed shrew as well. So 2 records fairly close together from about 5 kilometres apart. As you're probably all aware, the Mammal Society has been sort of running the Searching for Shrews project, getting people to send in pictures. As a result of that, if you go down to the bottom of the picture, near Mansfield, actually at Retford, somebody sent in a photograph of a dead shrew, which again looked very much like a greater white-toothed shrew. And the Mammal Society were able to get some barn owl pellets from probably, I think it's just about 500 meters away from there, which they sent me. 2 batches, one from 2021 and one from 2022. No great white-toothed shrew in the batch from 2022, but there was a single skull in the 2021 batch. So again, a definite record from Retford from 2021. Subsequently, and if you go over to sort of the left of the map, the Forest of Bowland, there's a question mark there. And this was someone who got in touch with the Society to say that they found a great white-toothed shrew near Stocks Lake in the Forest of Bowland in 1999. So it's strange what kind of comes out of the woodwork. Well, we don't know, obviously, we don't know for sure if that was a definite white-toothed shrew or not, but I guess there's no reason it couldn't have been. As Allan was mentioning, sort of the white-toothed shrew in Ireland has been spreading at about 5 kilometres a year. So Melissa's house is the M, roughly where the M is on the A1M here. And so if we take it that, you know, there was a great white-toothed shrew in her house in 2015, and that was the epicenter, if you like, of the introduction, which I'm sure it wasn't. But even assuming it was, so 7 years at 5 kilometres a year, this is how far the shrew could have spread across the northeast. So into North Yorkshire, well into Northumberland, getting over towards Cumbria. And of course, it's probably another couple of years since, so you probably have to expand that a little bit further still. Whether it has or not is another matter. And so far, what's happened with the Searching for Shrews project, so there's been a couple of thousand images scanned from the project, what Cat dragged in, sort of historical images, but it's going back and rechecking those. Shrew pictures on iRecord and Corio, and so far all they've turned up is the one likely shrew from Nottinghamshire that I mentioned before. Further 165 shrew records sent in this year, but again, all negative. Up in County Durham, myself and some friends, we've been trying to get hold of barn owl pellets, and we've checked them from 11 different locations so far. All of them have been negative, but interestingly, all of them have either been from north or west of the River Wear. So the River Wear runs to the north and west of the current records, and it may be that the Wear, it's a fairly big river, is acting as a little bit of a barrier. I've also checked some records from about 25, some barn owl pellets from 25 kilometres further south, and they are negative so far. So it may be that it hasn't spread that far, but really we don't know. The other thing we don't really know, and this is probably just an important part of this project, is where the other shrews are. So this is the map from the 2012 Mammals of the Northeast. And these are records of the pygmy shrew in the northeast we have at that time. And post 2000, actually in County Durham itself, there were only 2 records of pygmy shrew. That is up to 4 now. We've doubled the number of records of pygmy shrew, but that's it. That's all we know about pygmy shrew in County Durham. So if the pygmy shrew is disappearing, will we ever know it was there in the first place? And I'm sure that's the case for a lot of other parts of the country. We just don't have the records to know what the baseline situation is. It may be that the pygmy shrew isn't widespread. You know, we tend to, well, it's probably the case that common shrew is, and we'll have a lot more records for common shrew. Pygmy shrew is, the records are a lot more sparse. It may be that distribution is a little bit more sparse as well, but we simply don't know. So, and so the Mammal Society, you've got the Searching for Shrews project. As you probably know, the time-honoured method for finding great white-toothed shrews is you leave a bowl of porridge out overnight. Shrew comes along, gorges itself, then you find it asleep in the bowl the next day. I did that one at the Northeast Wildlife Recorders Conference. I was hoping it might have got a laugh. And when I looked at the audience, people were kind of looking quizzical, like, well, is he serious or not there? So I'll leave you to work that one out. But some methods that might work a little better for you. Barn owl or owl pellets are a really good method of finding out what's about. I put not long-eared coastal sites. If you live near the northeast coast as I do, there's always a possibility that a long-eared owl caught the shrew in the Netherlands and flew over the coast and sicked it for you. But otherwise, owl pellets are a really good method, and it's good fun as well. The Mammal Society is going to be running some workshops on that, and I believe also at the conference in August as well. So if you haven't done it, it needs to be on your bucket list. It's great fun. As Allan said, these shrews are all actually quite noisy. And Stuart Newsom, who runs B2 Acoustic Pipeline, some of you might be aware of that if you kind of work as bat consultants. You can upload bat recordings from full spectrum detectors to that and have them analysed. He, along with colleagues, have been working on analysis of other small mammal, rodent and insectivore calls, and they can be analysed using sonograms. So he's added a part to this the acoustic pipeline. So if you can submit bat detector records from the northeast, they will get analysed and they will pick up any great white-tailed shrew calls that are in there as well. And finally, live trapping, which is a little bit trickier. Of course, these are non-native species. So if you do catch one, you've either got to keep it as a pet or you've got to find some way of disposing it. Or probably even better still, this is Loki, who got mentioned earlier on, the three-legged cat. As you can see, all of Melissa's cats are really into wildlife. And he caught a series of shrews going back from 2014. So quite a lot of you will have cats, or see your friends will post pictures of cats. You know, cats are bringing an awful lot of wildlife. So if they do, take a photograph and upload it to the Mammal Mapper app, and it will give us a picture of where our shrews are. So yeah, a lot to do. We know they're out there. We don't know where they are, but they could be anywhere. So it's quite an exciting project for people to get involved with. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian and Allan. So we've got a few questions that come in via the Q&A and in the chat. So I'll go through those now. First one's kind of a bit about both of your backgrounds. So we've got a question from Martin at Overton School, who say hello. How did you both get into your roles? Do you find it fulfilling? Kind of what's the favourite thing about, researching shrews? Allan, Ian, you go first.
All right. Well, mine's a rather convoluted path because I didn't really start my education until I was in my 30s. But what I would say is you probably, to work in this area, you're going to need some kind of qualification. But also you're going to need probably more key than that. And the thing that kind of people all find they need to get a rung on the ladder is experience. Mm-hmm. And often that is a voluntary experience. And it doesn't really matter too much what kind of experience that is, with habitat creation, habitat management, or you might go out and volunteer with the local bat group and things like that. But that experience is, you're probably not going to get a foot on the ladder without that. What I would say is what I've noticed is once you do get a foot on the ladder, it's generally easy to sort of move around. Once you're established in a job working in niche conservation or ecology, it's just getting that foot on the ladder. So yeah, get some voluntary experience or paid experience if you can. Great advice, thanks, Ian. Allan, have you got anything to add?
Yeah, I would echo that as well. Like, we all start off, when we're younger with a curiosity of the natural world in general. It's a lot more on TV now these days as well. I think it's even timely that it was good, that the Wild Isles series was on BBC lately as well. I think we underestimate just how amazing the wildlife is around here too, and often underappreciated. I often find students are able to name, primates in South America more than they are able to name what's the species of mammal within Britain sometimes in class. But, I did the same. I kind of got volunteered and paid some short-time paid jobs working with either some societies or trusts when I was kind of between school and university, and kind of leapt off from there. And there's a lot more opportunities now as well, I would say, than when I was younger too, particularly with local groups to get yourself involved with. And there's a lot more emphasis now on ecological consultancy and environmental jobs as well, to get your foot in. As Ian was saying, this is treated a lot more seriously now than it used to be. And then if you want to follow a more academic career path like I have, as going then into a PhD and ultimately being a lecturer now. I would say there's plenty of opportunities, yes, but keep your eye out, and keep your eye out on organizations like the Mammal Society, yeah, and what they're doing and where they're doing it and what groups they're working with, because there's a lot of stuff going on.
Good tips, thank you, Alan. We've got plenty of opportunities to get involved voluntarily at the Mammal Society, if anyone attending is interested. We are running quite short on time, so I'll just pick a couple of questions from the chat. So we've had a couple of questions about kind of predation of the greater white-toothed shrew. Is there anything that either of you know of that will predate it? Is there any interest in kind of reintroduction of species, such as perhaps the American mink, or not reintroducing it, any species that would predate it, or kind of any interest in the reintroduction of species that might predate it? Sorry, that was very long-winded.
Well, I often say about shrews are not as palatable, let's say, to a lot of predators as rodents, mainly because they are distasteful, you know, because of their smell and their glands. Certainly birds of prey, we definitely know in Ireland that they're, you know, particularly within the range which they're in, they're becoming, you know, quite a staple in terms of the diet. You know, we have some records, some colleagues have done, you know, the pine martens have been eating, some of them within Ireland, which, you know, may be of interest as well. The species we're obviously concerned about its recovery, both within Ireland and Britain, absolutely. But I'm not sure, we don't really know yet about, you know, foxes and things like this. I'm not sure how much they would be eaten, but definitely birds of prey, I'd say they're going to become an important part, which, you know, could be under consideration as certain reintroduction programs as well. But yeah, not sure.
I'm saying as well that we already have kind of a major predator in the term form of the domestic cat, so probably else the wild predator is only going to add a small amount to however many they're catching.
Very true.
Thank you.
Bring in lots of them.
Last one, I suppose, a bit of a tricky question from Saskia here. So has any progress been made to understand the greater white-toothed shrew's influence on other shrew species? Obviously, Alan, you've outlined their impacts on pygmy shrews, but obviously on mainland Great Britain, we've got more kind of native shrews. Obviously, we're hoping to understand that from searching for shrews, but do you kind of have any indication on what we might find there? Do you have any predictions?
Well, it is a bit of an unknown. Like, do I think what's happened in Ireland will necessarily be replicated in Britain? I don't think we have enough evidence to say that at the minute, and probably within a larger shrew community, the levels of competition would be greater, particularly with the likes of the common shrew. There has been some research to suggest that they may outcompete, not exactly the common shrew, but the close one, the Malay shrew. But I don't think the evidence for that, to be honest, particularly convincing at the minute. So I still think the greater white might face a much more challenging prospect coming up against the common shrew. And I'm even thinking a little bit at the minute from Ian's findings and stuff as well. You know, within Ireland, it was straight away, it was everywhere, you know, when really, because it really didn't have anything up against it. You know, I'm not trying to put a slight to my beloved pygmy shrew, but, you know, when you're 3 times smaller than something, it's not exactly an even fight. But I think within Britain, we might not necessarily see the same impacts that we have seen in Ireland. So, you know, I'm not trying to be over dramatic about the potential impacts. Of course, there could still be negative impacts, but I have some doubts about it being as bad, because in Europe, you know, they do exist. Both those species are quite common, you know, particularly all the trapping I've done in France during my PhD. You find, you know, the Sorex and Crossadura, those species together, generally speaking, in high numbers. So, and even if you think of an invasive species getting off the ground early, it might be a little more difficult, you know, that they might be kept in smaller abundance as well because of this competition with the common shrew. I don't think so much with potentially not so much with the water shrew, but definitely with the common shrew. This could be, I think it'll be different than what has happened in Ireland, in my opinion anyway, based on everything we've seen so far. But obviously it's something we need to have a look into, because the pygmy shrew, as Ian was saying, is, I think, right? And generally speaking, we know it's a rare species within Britain because of the common shrew as well. So it still could impact it in Britain, though not necessarily though the common. Not sure what your opinion is, Ian, but
yeah, I mean, and as you said earlier on, the range of habitats is more diverse here as well, and then with the great white-tailed shrew being a more southern species, how it's going to get on in the northeast of England. It's pretty chilly up here. It may, it's obviously not stopping it, but it may take the edge off its competitive ability in some of the habitats we've got on mainland Britain. I think pygmy shrew being found at the top of Ben Nevis. I suspect it'll be a while before the great white-tailed shrew gets there.
yeah, because I think the records that's what Ian showed, this circle out, that if we thought it was there from 2015, if we were going to see something similar to Ireland, you would expect certainly at least significantly within that kind of radius that there would be more records showing up. And I know there has been a couple, some more records found recently, but again, we're still talking about generally sparse records, whereas in Ireland, straight away, as soon as we went out looking for them, they were everywhere.
I think it's worth saying as well, as it appears that they're not everywhere, it does give us a good opportunity to try and get a baseline on where the other species of shrew are, so that then we can have a better idea whether it's having to be completely fixed.
The neglected mammals, shrews always are. Yeah. And as you say, it would be an opportunity now that they're in people's minds a little bit more, because certainly this has happened in Ireland as well. I think people have become a lot more aware, because even when we were out trapping at the beginning, the farmers, for instance, knew that they were looking at something different and hearing something different, and they saw it everywhere, but they had no idea what it was. So that's where kind of raising awareness about these small mammals, shrews in particular, we need more records. I think the Mammal Society's recent publication on the kind of UK map led by Fraser here, kind of indicated that too, that these are a group of animals we don't know a lot about their distribution within Britain in general, I would say.
Thank you both. I'll leave that for questions for now. We do have a list of further questions if you're happy for me to pass them on to you, and then we can hopefully get some answers for people. So thank you firstly both of you, Allan and Ian, for your fantastic presentations and for joining us in this webinar. Thank you also to Jasmine, who was supposed to be hosting but unfortunately had some tech issues, so you're stuck with me. But I'll pass on now over to Matt, who will tell you a little bit more about how you can help us to understand where these shrews are.
Thanks, Emily, and a huge thanks to Allan and Ian. Fantastic presentations, really interesting. And I just wanted to give you a bit of an update at the end of this webinar on the next phase for the Searching for Shrews project that you've heard a lot about today. So you've also heard that, first of all, shrews can be tricky mammals to spot. It can be part of the ecosystem and completely unseen and therefore unknown. And you've also heard the importance of us actually having that data and being able to understand what's going on in those ecosystems and therefore what challenges might be faced by some of our other native species. So the Searching for Shrews project in the next phase is going to focus on the creatures that can find shrews where humans fail, not just cats this time, but actually barn owls. So you heard about the possibility of discovering whether shrews have been predated on by birds of prey by analysing their pellets. Well, we're delighted to be partnering this summer with the Barn Owl Trust, which should allow us to get pellets from barn owl roosts across the country. But we're going to need help to dissect those pellets and to gather the data on the small mammal remains that are inside. And so this will be a really key way of tracking the spread of greater white-toothed shrew this year and going forward. But we'll also yield some really useful data on other small mammal populations and especially shrews. So seeing if we find more information and more evidence of the distribution of pygmy shrews, for example. And then there'll also be some really interesting science findings about the changing habits of barn owl hunting. So please do watch out for more information on this exciting project. There will be ways for you to get involved as individuals, as local groups, and as schools, universities, and youth groups, because the more people we have dissecting these pellets and spending some time discovering what's inside, the more information and data we will collect. And to help us do that, we'll soon be launching a new book. There's already a very useful Mammal Society book on analysing owl pellets. However, we're bringing out a new photo-led guide to the bones that you might discover in an owl pellet, and how to find, by looking at the tiny little features of different jaw bones, different skulls, exactly what species that barn owl had for lunch. So that will be coming out in the next couple of months in partnership with the Natural History Museum. So that will be a real help to those that want to get involved in this project. So huge thanks to our speakers again. Huge thanks for Emily for stepping in to lead the Q&A session there. Please do sign up to the newsletter at the Mammal Society. You've heard about our fantastic Mammal Mapper app that you can download for free and start taking part in this and other projects where you record any mammal sightings that you might have. But please, in the meantime, thank you very much for joining. Please do keep an eye out for events like this in the future, and have a lovely afternoon.